Welcome to The Beat. Today we're very excited to have the poet Cornelius Eady with us. Eady will read several of his poems and we'll follow with a conversation. Cornelius Eady is a professor of English and a John C. Hodges Chair of Excellence at the University of Tennessee. From September 2021 to December 2022, he served as interim director of Poets House in New York City. Eady published his first collection, Kartunes, in 1980. His second collection, Victims of the Latest Dance Craze, was chosen as winner of the Academy of American Poets Lamont Poetry Award. He has since published 8 other collections, including The Gathering of My Name, nominated for the Pulitzer Prize, Brutal Imagination, a National Book Award finalist, and Hardheaded Weather, New and Selected Poems, which was nominated for an NAACP Image Award. In addition to his poetry, Eady has also written musical theater productions, collaborating with jazz composer Diedre Murray. The two worked on Running Man, a roots opera libretto based on Eady's poems that was named a 1999 finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in Drama, and Brutal Imagination, recipient of Newsday's Oppenheimer Award in 2002. Eady is also a musician. He performs with the band Rough Magic and the Cornelius Eady Trio, with whom he recently released the album Don't Get Dead, Pandemic Folk Songs. He has published 5 mixed media chapbooks with accompanying CDs, including Book of Hooks, Singing While Black, and all the American poets have titled their new books The End. With poet Toi Derricote, Eady founded Cave Canem, a beloved nonprofit organization that supports emerging Black poets via a summer retreat, regional workshops, prizes, events, and publication opportunities. In 2016, Eady and Derricote were honored with the National Book Foundation's Literarian Award for outstanding service to the American literary community on behalf of Cave Canem, and in 2023 awarded the Pegasus Award for service in the field of poetry by the Poetry Foundation. Eady's other honors include the Prairie Schooner Strousse Award, a Lila Wallace-Reader's Digest Award, and grants from the National Endowment for the Arts, the Guggenheim Foundation, and the Rockefeller Foundation.
I'm going to read some selections from a poetry cycle that I've been working on called Mercy, and it involves the first slave to publish a full-length book of poetry in the colonies, Phyllis Wheatley, or we now call her Phyllis Wheatley Peters. But she was captured in Africa around the age of 8 years old, brought over to America across the Middle Passage, and then was sold to a family called the Wheatleys in Boston. Phyllis's name comes from the name of the boat that took her over, which is the Phyllis, and the family that bought her, the Wheatleys. And she, again, published the first book that was ever published, a full-length book that was published by a slave, because there weren't no African Americans at that point. But it's a fascinating story. There is actually a film version of these poems, interpretation of these poems, that was just filmed up in Montreal this summer, and will probably be released sometime during next year, probably in the spring. I became fascinated by the story from a conversation that I had with an African-American scholar in Washington State years ago. Phyllis Wheatley has always been one of my I've always been fascinated by the work of Phyllis Wheatley and also the story of Phyllis Wheatley. And I was having this coffee with an African-American scholar, and she brought up an interesting point. Phyllis's book, her first book, was actually published in England. The Wheatley family had found a publisher because there was no publisher in the colonies that would publish her because she was African-American or she was Black. So Phyllis got on board a boat with one of the Wheatley family representing her, and she went over to England. The book was published. It was an incredible sensation. And then word got back that one of the Wheatley family, I believe one of the sisters, was very ill. And she got back on the boat and went back to Boston. Now, the dilemma or the question the scholar raised to me was, why did she get back on the boat? She had left America. There was no more slavery in England by that time. There was also a law, an English law that said basically if you set foot on English soil, you cannot be taken back to your country of imprisonment. So why would Phyllis Wheatley do that? Why would she do that? And that started me thinking about this idea of what it was like to be Phyllis, and also started me thinking about what it was like to be 8 years old when she was captured. What was it like to be an 8-year-old and having to learn a new tongue and a new language and a new culture? She was a prodigy, obviously. The Wheatley family she very quickly took to reading and writing, and they encouraged that. She was raised as almost as if she was a family member. But what was it like? What did it feel like to actually have to lose the language or to hold in the language? Her real name, the name of her parents, the location where she grew up until she was 8 years old. What would be the word for house, or what would be the difference between one way of eating and another way of eating? So I kept thinking about this. And I also started to realize as we read the book, one of the things about Phyllis Wheatley that's still sort of contested is that she doesn't talk a lot about a lot of the memories about being in Africa. But as a scholar pointed out to me, that wasn't true. There are places in the book, peppered all the way through the book, where she does bring up her memories of Africa. It's slight and it's fleeting, but they're there. And this first poem to Phyllis Wheatley's mother has an epigraph from Phyllis Wheatley's book where she actually mentions her mother and father. And I decided to write a poem to Phyllis's mother in an attempt to try to tell her what happened to her stolen child. To Phyllis Wheatley's mother. I, young in life, by seeming cruel fate, was snatched from Afric's fancied happy seat. What pangs excruciating must molest, what sorrows labor in my parents' breasts. Phyllis Wheatley. They say your daughter is a rare orchid. She lives in a fancy house on a high street. They named her after the ship which bore her wild, they claim, across the waves. They say your daughter is a cuckoo's egg. She walks the streets in English garb. She did not fill the shark's belly. She does not sweep, hoe, or breed. She stood just once upon the block. Your daughter is as exotic as white pepper. She reads, she travels, and when she dreams, a clean head kisses a starched pillow. She can cradle the owner's spell book between her dark hands. She has learned to sing in robber's tongue. Your daughter's quill makes patriots blink. Her black skin spooled parchment, poem, bill of sale. God has given her a kingdom you can hardly pronounce. Sometimes, in her famous book, a line will slip and she is returned unrefined. Before Mrs. Wheatley scooped the sickly child, fed her broth and bound books. Alas, my dusky mother, she writes, if only she knew, the first note of mercy is pain. Lexicon. The good Lord puts new sounds in the heathen's mouth. Holy is a word that burns the fingers as you cradle the book, a stern beard that plucks a child from her mother, a law that names you chattel, then blesses your soul. Turn the page and read a story about the skin you wear and what that mark earns you. Say faith, a veil of questions you get to pull back, perhaps, with your last breath. Roll it on your tongue, sickly girl, and then there's mercy. When you stood, shivering on the Boston dock, draped only in a dirty carpet, you had no words for what came towards you out of the wronged air. How your mind would lick that word like butter once you found it. God could not make her a poet. This is based on something that was written by Thomas Jefferson after he read Wheatley's book. This is always my fascination with Thomas Jefferson, who was clearly one of the most lively minds of his era. And yet he couldn't, with all that intelligence and all that scholarship and fervor for democracy, could not bring himself to think of a slave as his equal. So, in his estimation, when he read the book, I'm paraphrasing here, but basically what his estimation of the book was, religion could produce a Phyllis Wheatley, but it could not make her a poet. God could not make her a poet. Thomas Jefferson said this, more or less, after he read the musings of the clever African Phyllis Wheatley, a sensation of both the colonies and England, a black patriot, though a slave. Whatever a black hand can build, he knew, could only be guided by a master's vision, like this room of the mansion he probably wrote his opinion in. What black mind can dream in these proportions and gather the slope of these Virginia hills so lovingly to his window? God could give her words, but the subtle turn, like giving a gull a sack of gold. Benighted. In order to learn this word, the slave girl has to shake off her pagan tongue. She is ape to her owner's hearing. They are an alphabet, a cup of noise poured into her dark ear. Apples don't know they have a name, have a taste, crisp or tart, a way to describe how it feels when white teeth break the skin. The beagle never knows what their owners call his breed, only his master's whistle. The Bible will tell her there was a young, dark girl before she found mercy, hoof, drum, and mud was her middle name. The hatchling doesn't know what to call its egg tooth, why the first word of her new world is called Phyllis. English. Stop saying that and say this. Stop wearing this and put that on. Sink your teeth into this, and tongue bid farewell to that. Bit by bit, word by word, the young slave's speech is chiseled. Make your hands learn this, lay your dark head on that. Translate mercy, black girl. Clear your throat. Diabolic. And this is from a line in her most famous poem, on being brought to America from Africa. It's an 8-line poem. And to me, it's the basis of everything you're going to need to know about African American poetry, poetics, and the argument about it going forward. Diabolic. Their color is a diabolic dye. Phyllis Wheatley. What they say they are, and what they actually do, is what Phyllis overhears. It's like she isn't there. It's like she's a ghost at arm's length, hearing the living curse out the dead, which she's been led to believe no decent person does in a church. How they say they love her and how they look at her is what Phyllis observes, like she's a hole in the pocket after the money rolls out. God loves everybody, even the sinner, they say. Even a mangy hound can rely on a scrap of meat scraped off the plate, they say. What they testify and what they whisper in earshot is as dark as her skin, whistled from opposite sides of a mouth. Is she the Bible's fine print? And the last poem in the cycle, I'm still working on the cycle, but the last poem that I'm going to read is called The Trial of Phyllis Wheatley, and this is based on a true story. Henry Louis Gates has a very slim book about this event. Phyllis started writing poems, I think, when she was around 11 or 12. They became broadsides that became circulated around Boston. And at a certain point, people started to wonder if she really was the person who was writing those poems, if she was real. So they actually got a committee together. John Hancock was one of the people on the committee to determine, to prove that this young slave actually composed these poems. The Trial of Phyllis Wheatley. She claims she wrote a book. But here's what could have happened. In order to make a point, to move things along, a rich white man in pre-revolutionary Boston decides to raise some abolitionist sand by pretending to be a young black female slave. Burning with the good word, bristling with Alexander Pope. Maybe he owns a printing press. Maybe he got some buddies to go along with the gag. Up and down the block fly the broadsides. Between slugs of ale and church hymns, the panic of black verse. An alternative could be all of the above plus a young black female slave bearded to the cause. Teach her to recite just enough. Petticoat her just enough. An indentured rebel. Written by Phyllis Wheatley, a slave owned by John Wheatley. Verse by Phyllis Wheatley, a teen Ethiopite of Africa. If a Negro can write a poem, why not a fish then? Why not a cloud with feet? What is your name? A long way from home, sir. What is your tongue? Poetry and the breath of the Lord. What is your accent? A patriot, sir. It will take a jury of proper white men to prove this true. John Hancock to swear in ink this we saw. The paper, the quill, her black hand singing. I also like writing about jazz and musicians. To me, they're kind of like unsung poets. Some of these people, like for example, one of my favorite blues singers, Son House, who I actually met in my hometown of Rochester, New York, was really very articulate, and I just think that a lot of those things are, you get kind of African American artists get pushed sideways into certain things. Like for example, Nina Simone wanted to be a opera singer, but couldn't get in because she was African American and got shoved into being Nina Simone. So, to me, they're unsung poets. This one is about the very famous album "Kinda Blue." Kind of. My friend is writing about the first time he listened to Kinda Blue by Miles Davis. And I tell him, yes, I bet everyone has a story. Kind of like their first kiss. How did it happen? Where were you? On which of your younger days did Paul Chambers' bass first lick your ear? Did you first think you didn't want anything to do with that crazy stuff? No words, no verse, choruses. music for dark classes and cigarette holders? Did one of your friends, a convert, drag you to the stereo, fired up by the sight of a world wider than the narrow, invisible rails you were running on? The record is famous for this. The record that readjusts your opinion. And you pause. The needle has hit a new groove. On which of your younger days did the afternoon simmer down, and that smoothness called out to you, and then everything else? This is a poem about Lester Young and Charles Mingus. When Lester Young died, Charles Mingus wrote this great elegy for him called Goodbye Pork Pie Hat, because Lester Young wore pork pie hats. And it's also about Billie Holiday. Lester Young and Billie Holiday were really good friends. Depending on who you talk to, they were romantically involved or they weren't. But years ago, when the national networks were obligated to deal with the arts, there was this TV show called The Sound of Jazz that was taped in New York at the CBS broadcast studios. And they brought all these people together to start talking about what the new sounds in jazz were. And it actually became a reunion for Billie Holiday and Lester Young. In fact, it's the last time I think they ever played together. There's this wonderful shot after she sings Fine and Mellow, which I'm going to quote in the poem, where after the song is done, they walk out, the doors are open, you can see 57th Street, I think is where the studios were. And you see them talking to each other, and then they both go in opposite directions. And as far as I could tell, that's the last time they see each other, ever. Goodbye, pork pie hat. Charlie Mingus wrote this mournful goodbye. Had the horns sound like a room filled with old men watching the barge slip into the river towards the other side. Lost uncles, fathers, brothers, the stink of tobacco, splash of gin, the coolness some of them carried, the ones we think of when we remember certain diners. Because Lester Young had that sound. You can hear it as he plays with Billie Holiday in a 50s TV studio. Fine and mellow. Love, that faucet which turns off or on. How that dumb hope for maybe next time rises from their lips and tongues and throats. Because Lester soothes the bruises on Billie's voice one last time. They chat, then walk out of the studio into loveless New York, never to meet again. In the elegy, the horns sound like a warm hand clasping a cold one on the cooling board, then letting go. Otis Redding. This is a poem about Otis Redding. He died in a plane crash that hit a lake in Wisconsin, 1967. He was coming back from a gig. And there's a photo of him. I saw it only once on a TV show, special, where you can see him being dragged up from the lake the next day. And I've always thought about this. So this is a fractic, I guess, poem about that photo. Otis Redding being pulled from Lake Monoma. January, Wisconsin, 1967. At the crash site, they've pulled Otis into the boat, arms akimbo, still dressed for the gig he sang the night before. Up from the sunken, fickle plane, the silt swirled by guitar cases, sweat laid on electric piano keys, boxes of band amps and mics and speakers which only sang of love. Below, the backbeat lies sopped. All that was faulty, weather, fatigue, faithless part, will be washed into a photo a cop now clicks to file. It's a blues to break a heart, the end of a young man's shout, the fall and sinking of every bump and grind we felt we had coming from that throat. What do these loons care about the funk hidden beneath the bow of this small craft, or that this black man, gently harvested by the morning shift, soon to be ferried home on the monochromatic waves, was only the night before, knee-deep in the business of sweat, moved in well-dressed fire to plead, to unbutton, moved with love's unstoppable fuse. Piano solo, Thelonious Monk on The Man I Love. Thelonious, of course, if people know him, was a fantastic composer and jazz pianist, but also was kind of his own man, I guess, is the best way of putting it. And he would tick people off, right? There was this wonderful session that was recorded on Christmas Eve, I think around 1954, where he's playing with Miles and Milt Jackson and some other people. And you can hear this take of The Man I Love. First take, they're starting, and then you hear some commotion, and then you hear Miles' voice coming in, and what's going on is that they're about to play a ballad, and he knows that Monk will not play it straight. So Miles is trying to tell Monk to just lay out, shut up, lay out, don't play on this. And then you hear the, and then you hear Miles talking to the engineer, and he says to the engineer, get all this down, get all of it. Then it stops, and then it's the second take, which is absolutely gorgeous. Piano solo, Thelonious Monk on The Man I Love. On the first take, Miles Davis tells Monk's strange-fingered Thelonious to shut up, to lay out. It's a ballad. No tinkering, brown pixie dust against the groove. No wading through the measures the way an albatross slops up to the sky. Miles is a man who was used to having his own way. And if Monk were a woman, who knows where this might end? But then Milt Jackson replays, rethinks the intro, the hushed tones of a man clearing his throat before his chords vibrate in prayer. And these five men, who seem to have nothing better to do on Christmas Eve, 1954, get back to the lyric. Love is food, water, air. Lonely sucks. Then from out of the negotiations, plinks Monk. Toy piano Monk, that stumble-bum bird. The boy who will always grab the wrong crayon. I'll read one more poem. And this is not a music poem, but this is a poem about Emmett Till. And it's about his casket, the story of his casket. I'm sure most people know about the details of how he was murdered. After he was killed, they sent his body back to Chicago, where he had come down for that summer. And his mother demanded that there be an open casket. And I think I remember his mother saying, I want the whole world to see what they did to my boy. And so it was a casket with a glass top. And then it was buried. Then there was a trial. And during the trial, the defendants insisted they needed proof. This is a retrial, I think, actually. They wanted proof that the person in the casket really was Emmett Till. So they exhumed the body, went back to the cemetery, exhumed the body, did a DNA test to determine it really was Emmett Till in that coffin. But legally, you can't rebury a body in the same casket. So they put Emmett in a different casket and reburied him. And the glass-top casket ended up in a shed in the cemetery grounds. Years later, the owners of the cemetery had some legal problems. They closed the cemetery down. They started to do an inventory of the grounds. They went to the shed. They found the old casket. They opened it up, and there were a family of possums living in the casket. Emmett Till's glass-top casket. By the time they cracked me open again, topside, abandoned in a tool shed, I had become another kind of nest. Not many people connect possums with Chicago, but this is where the city ends after all. And I float still after the footfalls fade and the roots bloom around us. The fact was, everything that worked for my young man worked for my new tenants. The fact was, he had been gone for years. They lifted him from my embrace, and I was empty, ready. That's how the possums found me, friend. Dry-docked, a tattered mercy hull. Once I held a boy who didn't look like a boy. When they finally remembered, they peeked through my clear top. Then their wild surprise.
Welcome, Cornelius Eady. I'm so glad you're here.
Thank you, Alan. Thanks for inviting me.
We're so glad that you're here in Knoxville and that you can come and talk to us here in the public library. I have just a few questions I wanted to ask. I'm always interested in origin stories, and I'm wondering, how did you get started out as a poet?
Well, Alan, I'm 70 years old now, so that's a long story. But I'll give you the Reader's Digest version. Basically, I started writing as kind of sort of connected to songwriting. I wasn't really writing songs back then, but I was really into the lyrics of a lot of the songs that were coming out during the time. This is the 60s, right? So I started writing dry, what I would call dry lyrics, in iambic pentameter, but no real melodies to them. But then I ran into a high school teacher whose name was then Joanna Mason, her married name, in my high school in Rochester, New York. And she was so instrumental in just being so understanding and kind about a kind of a nerdy guy who just sat around scribbling into his notebooks. But it was meeting her. I have this theory that if you scratch the surface of any poet, at some point you will find a teacher. and Joanna was mine. So that's the basic start of it. And also there's a library connected to this, which is why I'm really happy we're doing this in a library. I love libraries. Most of my reading, because the bookstores were kind of thin in Rochester, most of my reading for poetry was at the Rundell Memorial Library, which is in downtown Rochester. And I really just, libraries were just places of wonder for me because it was allowed me to, it was quiet, it was stable. It was a lovely place to go and write. I tell the story often about the reading room in the Rundell Library, where basically you have long wooden tables as you go in. And back in the day, when I was starting out, they had two machines on as you came in. For 25 cents, you could buy a writing tablet, and for a nickel, you could buy a pencil. And that's basically what I would do. I spent hours of my time hanging out in the library. I love libraries and librarians. I've actually been an accidental librarian. About a year ago, I was asked to be interim director for a poetry library in New York called Poets House. And that was, in some ways, a kind of a dream come true. I became a temporary accidental librarian. So libraries really figure deeply into my makeup, my DNA of being a poet. But the thing about it, of course, is that you start realizing what poetry is good for, right? When my high school teacher was actually the editor of the literary magazine, and my first 4 poems ever published were published in that literary magazine. One of the poems was about Martin Luther King, who had just been assassinated. And I wrote this poem called Why. It's a bad poem, but it was a rhyming poem, and it basically saying why. And the magazine came out. It was a big high school, I think about 500 students, maybe 500 students in it. And I'd be walking the halls, and I noticed that people would say, "There he is, that's him. That's the poet." Or students would come up to me and say, "I read that poem you wrote. I love that poem you wrote about Martin Luther King. That's how I felt." And that's when I started to understand the connection poetry had with the reader. That basically you could be saying things that other people were feeling but couldn't articulate themselves. So that became kind of I use this term lately these days, but that became kind of the catnip for me, and started leading me on the path to where I am now.
You mentioned writing in rhyme and meter starting out, and I think I've noticed that a lot of your poems have either 3 or 4 feet per line. Mm-hmm. Is that kind of, when you're sitting down and you're in the writing process, are you starting out by writing in meter, or do you use meter to get you going? Or?
Well, I call it organization, right? I don't necessarily write in fixed forms unless, of course, I'm writing songs. I always tell my students it's either fixed or unfixed forms. You can call it free verse, but I don't think there's anything free about it. At a certain point, you have to organize what's on the page. And as you're noticing, I tend to do that. I tend to organize in 3 or 4 beat lines, right? They start falling into that, so it becomes tercets or it becomes quatrains, maybe, right? It depends. It's a combination of the subject matter and the way I'm hearing it as beats in my head. But at some point, there's always some sort of organizational structure to the poem, even if it's not going to be a sestina or a sonnet.
Do you have a certain ritual for writing? Do you like to write in a certain time and place? I know that some writers have a very regimented way of writing. Is that true for you?
Well, the people who can make space to write, they're really fortunate, because there's no real good way of doing this, right? At least the way that I understand it, and it certainly hasn't been my life. I have to sometimes figure out ways of making time in order to write. There's a certain kind of selfishness you have to be a writer. By that I mean you have to defend your space, your writing space. So sometimes it varies from year to year to where I am. What's going on. There's no real rhyme or reason to it. The only thing that accelerates it is that I'm also in theater. And when I was doing plays with my writing partner, Diedre Murray, theater has its own kind of schedule to it, time frame to it. Sometimes you have to redo a scene very, very quickly, and I can't use my poetry brain to sit and contemplate, right? You have to simply just jump in and finish the scene or rewrite the scene because there's a composer waiting to rewrite the music, and there's some actors waiting to figure out how to sing it. So you can't be the person that delays it or becomes the stopper, right? So I've learned to do a lot of things. I've learned how to write quickly. I love being able to spend some time to sit and just contemplate writing. There's no real pattern to it. Now, if my wife was here sitting next to me, she'd definitely say, what he does is basically waits until I go to bed, and then I write. And I do that too, but it's no real ritual to it.
I guess you say that you've always been writing songs, and that kind of led you to poetry. Do you have any thoughts on the difference between the two for you, and just in terms of how you write? And I think a lot of poets love music and musicians because they don't really get to collaborate so much, and I think collaboration means a lot, and seems like it would be a lot of fun to solitary writers. I guess if you could just talk a little bit about the difference in the experience of being a singer or songwriter in a band, and then the solitary act of writing as a poet.
Well, they all bleed. As you were saying about poets and musicians, you made me think of Paul Muldoon, who was the editor for The New Yorker for a while, and also Alice Quinn. Alice Quinn actually invited Joni Mitchell to send some lyrics to her, and she printed it in The New Yorker as a poem. And Paul Muldoon is good friends with Paul Simon and other musicians as well, and also Paul McCartney. So clearly there's this free exchange between poets and songwriters. And of course, there's the songwriters that use great poetic devices in their work, like Joni Mitchell, like Bob Dylan, like Leonard Cohen, who was actually a poet. I mean, I think there's a difference between Cohen and Dylan in the sense that Cohen is a poet who's writing songs, and you can see the kind of difference in the lines opposed to Dylan, who uses poetic references and devices. It's a difference. It's a slim difference. It may not be enough to worry about, but to my ear, there's a distinct difference between the two of them. I love them both. It's not an either or. It's not like I prefer one to the other. It's just I notice different things about it. For me, like I said, I started off writing what I would call dry lyrics, without music to it. The difference for me between songs and poetry is the melody. I mean, the words it's a different way we use our throat. What you just heard me do was read the poem with its own sort of song and meter to it, but no melody. When I'm writing a song, it has to be attached to notes, to an arrangement. And if I'm working with other people, it has to be something that allows people to have the ability and the space to add whatever they can to the basic elements of the song. So it's a work process thing in some ways for me, I guess. It's basically my intentions as a song is to actually put a melody to it and figure out a way of singing it, as opposed to simply putting it on the page and reading it to a microphone, to an audience. They're two different styles of delivery as far as in my mind. I'm sure other people think about this in different ways, but for me, that's the way it kind of works for me.
I always like to ask poets about their favorite writers. Who did you start reading early on, and who are your favorite writers now?
Oh, geez, I'm a big fan of so many people. When I was reading poetry in the Rundell Library as a teenager, I really feel it was a lucky break in some ways, that I didn't have somebody telling me what I should be reading, what I shouldn't be reading. I was simply in the stacks and I was finding things. So somebody there, some buyer, whoever bought the poetry books at that time from the Rundell Library, was wonderful because all the beats, the New Directions things and the City Lights books, they were all there. Books I wouldn't have found otherwise. So that was one thing. It's how I first read Anne Sexton. It's how I first ran into James Wright. It's when I first ran into Robert Bly. There's this awkward story about me and Bly. The Lie Around the Body, I think, was his first book, and it was in the library. And it's the only book I ever stole. because I loved the book and I looked and saw it, and no one has been checking it out, so I decided I took it home and never returned it. Years later, I'm interviewing Bly for a local cable station, and as we go through the interview, and between takes, I think I need to blurt this out to Bly. I need to let him know how much I love this first book. I love this book so much, Robert. I stole it, thinking he'd be approving of it. He wasn't, of course. But it was that kind of passion. Maybe there's no way of putting it, right? You pick up a poet and then you just I'd be really passionate about it. I was very passionate about the Latin American poets like Neruda and Nicanor Parra and Lorca. It was just one of those things where basically I just absorb them, and then I'd read, everything I could get my hands on, and it'd just be one of the things that, I think the young poet is one of those things where he just becomes kind of a sponge, right? You just absorb all these different things, and then you start filtering it out. Right, figuring out what's working for you and what doesn't work for you, what you like and what you don't like, or how your position on the writer will change or shift over the years. The example I always like to use is Frank O'Hara. When I was a teenager, I thought, my God, the guy is brilliant, my God. And then a few years later, in my 20s, or late 20s, early 30s, reading him again, and I'm thinking, my God, all he does is list things. My God, how lazy, I can't believe I like this guy. And then a couple of years later, I begin again, and I go, oh my God, and he knocks me out, right? What I tell my students is that when they decided to commit to a program or they decided to step on this path, they're starting a conversation with literature. They're starting a conversation with that larger context. And I think that's what I was doing. I'm having this conversation with Frank O'Hara even though he's dead, right? Or I'm thinking about Walt Whitman and I'll see some line in his, and I'll realize, oh my God, I have a different take on what that line actually means now. It's a conversation with Walt even though he's long gone. One of the poets that I always return to is Emily Dickinson, because I love telling people about the idea of how if the voice feels real, you will follow the voice everywhere and anywhere. And the example I use is her famous poem, I Heard a Fly Buzz When I Died, which no one questions. Right? She says it with such authority. You don't think, I came back from the dead and I decided to write you a poem. Right? It's just, I heard a fly buzz when I died. Stillness in the air, and on we go. She convinces you this, I am really a corpse talking to you. I've written a poem from the dead about the moment I died. Right? So I love telling people about these different effects that poets have. And I can go on and on. I mean, some of the poets that were my favorite poets, I never dreamed when I was a kid. In my first poetry workshop, I had this great poetry workshop in Rochester run by this poet named Patricia Janus. And we would do things. Maxine Kumin's first book I read, the Book of Nightmares from Galway Canal was the first time I read it. Her poem, The Bear. I have this really big memory of us reading The Bear a few stanzas at a time and passing the poem along. It's a poem where some guy's in the woods and he gets the bear and he kills the bear and he opens the bear and he goes inside the bear. I mean, and it's like this crazy poem. But we were reading it like it was contraband, like it was a secret passed among us, right? I never would have dreamed in a million years that I'd actually meet Galway Canal when I was a teenager. That thought would never cross my mind. Somebody had entered that room from the future and said, not only are you going to meet Galway Canal, but you're going to teach in the MFA program at the new school. You're going to hang out with Galway Canal. I would have laughed in their faces, right? Because it would never cross my mind that poetry, that my poetry could get there. Right?
Yeah.
So a lot of poets that I know are people that I have been fans of. Interviewing Robert Bly, for example, to bring that up again. I never dreamed that poetry would do this. There was a Yiddish poet in Rochester whose name, unfortunately, I always forget these days. But one of the things that he would say that was kind of one of the hallmarks of the poetry workshop in Rochester, poetry is the poet's passport, was what he said. And that has proved to be kind of true for me. It's taken me places I wouldn't expect, I would never dreamed when I was a teenager I would end up going. I got to go to Kenya because of that. I got to go to France because of that. I got to go to Germany because of that. It's one of those things where basically you can't imagine where the path is going to lead you once you get on the path. And reason for that, some of the poets that I actually admire, I actually got to meet. Sharon Olds was one of those poets. Minnie Bruce Pratt is one of those poets. It's just you read the books and then you get to meet the writer. One of my great memories was when I met Sonia Sanchez. It's a weird story because I was at the 92nd Street Y. Audre Lorde had just died. She was supposed to do a reading with Audre Lorde and Lucille Clifton and Sonia Sanchez. But Audre Lorde had died. And then I got a phone call to come and read with them, with Sonia and Lucille. It was almost like a suppressed memory because since it wasn't official, I sort of decided that I never read 92nd Street Y for some reason over the years, but this really happened. I get there a little late, the green room, they're walking towards the stage, and I'm walking towards this woman, this really smallish woman, and suddenly it occurs to me, oh my God, that's Sonia Sanchez. And I want to tell you something. I meet a lot of poets. I know a lot of famous poets, but certain poets are another realm for me, and Sonia's one of those poets. And I went, oh my God, what am I doing? I can't read with Sonia Sanchez. She's Sonia Sanchez. That was my panic. That was my needless panic. Sonia Sanchez is one of the sweetest human beings that still walks the planet. And it was a great evening of reading with those two. But I would never dream when I was a teenager that I would ever be at the 92nd Street Y reading with Sonia Sanchez and Lucille Clifton. And that's part of the library of the poets that I've admired through the years.
I had a similar experience like that with Jean Valentine.
Oh, yes. I taught with Jean Valentine at Sarah Lawrence College. Yes.
Yeah, she was so incredibly nice and generous.
Yes.
I was at a small university library, and she agreed to come and read at the library, and it was just a great experience.
Oh, that's totally Jean. Thank you for reminding me of that. Yes, that sounds like that's a total Jean move. Yes.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming here and reading poems for us and talking to us. I've enjoyed this so much.
Thank you, Alan. I've enjoyed it too, and thank you again for inviting me.